I want you to think back to the last meeting that you had. Think about the people that were there, where were they sitting, maybe even what were they wearing. Can you remember anything about them? Their title, their position, even the topic of the conversation? Well, I'm going to tell you what, a lot of times people miss one of the most important marks when it comes to relationships or engaging with other people in the workplace. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So if you think about your last meeting or the last time that you met for a formal professional setting and you can't seem to remember much, it's more likely than not because you're operating from something called a specific frame of mind. I'm going to use my board here for reference. But today we're going to talk about specific and diffuse. And these are two traits, cultural traits, invisible cultural traits, which is much of the work that I discuss in my videos, that people will lean towards without really knowing. So think about these two terms, specific and diffuse, as a scale. So you're either going to lean more one way or the other. And there really isn't anything wrong with either of those two, by the way. It just happens to be that they have different objectives and purposes, and the way that you present yourself in a professional setting will make a significant difference depending on which one of these two leanings you have. Also, if you understand this, it's like any other skill. You can develop skill in either of these. So, for instance, if you happen to have a leadership style that's very directive and tactical and authoritative, you can learn to be more relational in the way that you lead, but you have to learn that, right? You have to train yourself to do that. So think about it the same way here, and in some way you just kind of like make that scale a little bit bigger. But I'm going to start with an example to help you illustrate this point. So I was in a meeting the other day, and I was meeting a few new colleagues from different places in the world. And the meeting started out as most meetings do, where people present themselves, they give their name, they give, maybe their tenure or the amount of time they've worked within their organization or within the job that they're in, and so on and so forth. You get the point, right? So my name is Antonio, and I've worked for this company for 15 years, and my title is, this, and that. And typically, that's how most of the meetings go. At least that's how they go in the US, right? Because, by the way, we have a very specific type of leaning in the way that we do our leadership. So we tend to focus a lot on position, process, titles, due process, in other words. And that's a very specific type leaning, which we're going to come back to the board here in just a minute. Now, during that call, there was a woman, when she presented herself, she said, I live in Ireland, but I'm originally from Greece. And that caught my attention. Now, I've only been to Greece once, and it was an incredible trip. I went to Athens. So I kept that little nugget of information at the back of my head, right? So when it was my turn to introduce myself, I stated my name, but that was it. I didn't state anything else other than my name. My immediate next sentence was, and by the way, and then I called her name, I said, I went to Greece last year. I went to Athens. It's the very first time I've been to Greece, and I absolutely loved it. And then I talked a little bit about that. I didn't really go on too long, but I talked for maybe about an hour, about a minute or two about my trip to Greece. Well, wouldn't you believe, when she immediately interjected, and ultimately that turned into like a 5-minute conversation where I got to learn so much more about her, what she does, and ultimately how we're going to be working together. That type of leadership style is known as diffuse. It's on the right-hand side. It's very contrary to the specific type of leadership or the specific type of cultural leaning that we have in the US. Now, some people are kind of scratching their head, and I know after the fact, some were kind of thinking, what just happened in that very brief interaction that was so memorable? In fact, I could tell you right now, I remember very few things about the meeting, but I do remember her, and I remember the fact that she's from Greece. And that's because my focus was on this. Now, other people that might have a more specific leaning might remember different parts of the meeting, maybe something about a process or a procedure, and that's perfectly fine, by the way. But ultimately, it's important that you realize how this is coming across, right? So let's kind of dive into these a little bit more. And the reason why I think this matters a lot is because ultimately everybody wants to be more relatable and more memorable in the way that they interact with one another at work. I mean, I imagine this is true for pretty much everybody, regardless of what your leaning might be, culturally speaking, in terms of this leadership style. But when we want to be more relational with people and we're operating from this framework, it's going to be very difficult to create those lasting impact or that lasting impact or memory with the people that we work with, because we're not utilizing any of these skills. We're operating off of these skills. So remember, how do we start the meeting? We say, hey, my name is Antonio. I'm in this position. I've worked for the company for this many years. You might even say my goal in this meeting is to do A, B, and C. And all of that is good. There's, like I mentioned earlier, there's nothing wrong with that. But that's very focused on objectives and procedures and process and uncovering a little bit about your professional leaning. Whereas if you tend to operate more from this diffuse standpoint, like I did during that meeting, my objective wasn't in trying to tell the people that I was meeting that day how many years I've worked with the company or what my specific title is. In fact, people very rarely remember titles, by the way. I mean, there might be a few people who do, but I mean, more often than not, if you could name 15 people right now and give me their titles, I bet you wouldn't be able to remember maybe 2 or 3 of them. But you could remember different things about those people. For instance, this person likes blueberry muffins. That person likes to do yoga. This person likes, has 4 kids. You might remember other facts. And by the way, all that operates in this dimension, the diffuse dimension. So relatability, or our ability to relate and connect with other people, resides almost entirely on this side over here. And by the way, that is something that I discuss in my book. So we'll get to that a little bit later, but there's an entire chapter dedicated to this type of leadership. So let's start with specific. Usually, and I need to check myself here, I tend to be a little biased sometimes with my own cultural inclination. So I think it goes without saying, but I tend to lean more diffuse in the way that I engage in my own leadership style. So keep me honest here, guys. If I'm being a little too harsh on the specific, let me know. I know that a lot of people, especially in the Western culture, operate this way. So like I mentioned, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But there are some, basement qualities. And there's basement qualities here too. We'll get to those in just a minute. But there are basement qualities to either of these. But ultimately, the reason why I think this matters a lot is because if you ask somebody, like point blank, how do you want to be known or referred to or thought of in a professional setting? And most people would not necessarily answer with, well, I want people to know that I went to X, Y, and Z school and that I have, 2 degrees in this and that, and that I have 20 years with the company. They don't necessarily want you to know that. They want you to know, well, I'm actually a really good listener, or I'm very good at marketing. I've just built a reputation around creative marketing. So maybe those are the things that you really want your audience to take away, but yet we're leading with this, and that's a problem. So we're going to fix that, all right? Let's start with specific. So first and foremost, boundaries. I'll come back to these little icons at the end. Boundaries, specifically clear boundaries. So if you want to lean more specific with your culture, I'll come back to the board here in just a minute, then you need very clear boundaries. And what do those boundaries look like? It could be, you're in a meeting about some process or procedure that you want to fix. Well, your focus needs to be on that, which means don't talk necessarily about your weekend plans or the weather, or don't get distracted with little things that are unrelated to the topic at hand. And by the way, there are times when even people who have this diffuse type leaning, as is the case with me, need to be very prescriptive in the way that they're engaging their audience. And this could be, there are meetings that are very tactful, right? Or tactical. For instance, if our objective is to identify a safety incident that took place, and this safety incident is, paramount to our organization, to the safety of the individual. So that's not a good time to figure out if somebody is from Greece or not, and what kind of relationship we have or commonality we have there. The focus of that meeting needs to be on identifying the root cause so that we can prevent a reoccurrence. So in that setting, a very specific type leaning is going to work well. But bear in mind, that is the case for that meeting, which could be a different situation when you're meeting people for the very first time and it's like a meet and greet, right? You don't want to be very specific there. I mean, you can if you want to, of course, if you want to lean that way, but ultimately you're not going to create those memorable, connections. That is probably really the main objective when you do a meet and greet. The second thing is directness. So in a very specific leaning, ultimately, maybe just to backtrack a little bit, if we peel back the layers of the onion, the reason why people would lean one way or the other is very culturally biased. So people who come or have usually lived or worked in a Western environment in the United States and Australia, most of Europe, but not all of Europe, and things like that, and countries like that, very Western leaning, tend to be more specific. Whereas people who are, say, from Latin America or from Asian countries tend to be more diffuse. So, and it's, you just kind of see that in the way people interact, in the way that people behave, in the way that people talk. Specific is, again, very clear boundaries. You don't really mix, or maybe another way to put it is the idea of workplace balance, right? So your personal life is your personal life and your work life is your work life. And you try to keep those two very separate. You don't really let them mix hardly ever. Whereas people who have a diffuse cultural leaning tend to see their workplace as an extension of their personal life. So therefore, having friendships within the workplace or discussing personal matters at work are seen as a very natural component of their culture. So again, there's nothing right or wrong with either of them. It's just those leanings that we have naturally. But it's very good for you to do a self-inventory. So for instance, if you're like, no, I hardly ever talk about my family at work, ever. They don't even know that, X, Y, or Z. You might have kids, you might not have kids, you might have a spouse, you might not have a spouse, you might have had some kind of an illness or, whatever might happen, or, any personal matter, you keep those locked, you just tight lip, you don't really talk about that at work, then more likely than not, you have a specific type leaning. If you are a little more, I don't know, maybe nonchalant would be the word when it comes to the type of discussions that you have at work. Like maybe you'll just throw out, oh yeah, my 14-year-old daughter is having a soccer tournament and I'm going to be the referee. And, she's been really struggling with whatever. So that tends to be a very diffuse type leaning. You can tell right away somebody that even speaks that way would lean more specific, okay? So let's move back to, more diffuse I meant to say. Let's move back to specific. So we already identified clear boundaries. So if you want to keep this type of leaning, or if you just want to observe it in others, you're going to notice that they tend to have very clear boundaries. And this is good, by the way, if you lean more diffuse and you're in a meeting with somebody who is more specific, then don't try to pry. That's why sometimes, I've heard this many times, you go meet somebody for the first time and you're like, man, I don't know, that didn't really go that well. And I was trying to ask him a lot of questions and, trying to know more about their family and their background. And I don't know, there was just something about them that we just didn't click. Well, more likely than not, it's because of this. They might have a very specific leaning. They might be a perfectly wonderful individual, very likable, very agreeable. They might have even enjoyed speaking with you and getting to know you from that professional setting, but they just have these boundaries. And this tends to happen, by the way, very subconsciously. So the goal of understanding this from the perspective of both my book and this video is to bring this subconscious knowledge to the conscious level, so that when you're in a meeting and then you're like thinking to yourself, man, why am I not really, I remember, it's because I'm leaning too specific. I'm focused too much on boundaries. Maybe I need to open up a little bit more. Or the other way around. Maybe, you're seeing people kind of getting a little frustrated because, guys, we haven't really achieved anything. We've been doing a lot of small talk, but this is really important. We need to stay focused. So when you hear the word focus, like, guys, focus. If you are in any meeting, any setting, and somebody says, guys, let's focus, that is a key word for specific. They're basically trying to reel you back in to a very process or procedure oriented discussion. These people are interested in process and procedure. And it could be the person, like an actual person's identity, and that's just the way they are, or it could be the purpose of that discussion or that meeting, even if they tend to lean more diffuse. Again, think about like a safety related meeting. In a safety or very tactical, maybe it's a quarterly review, maybe it's a performance review. So those discussions tend to be very focused on process and procedures. Therefore, any efforts to create relatability and openness are going to fall flat because really you're missing the point. And then I would say I think we've kind of covered most of these elements. Objectives. So I have like this little icon up here. It's called a checklist. So I want you to be able to remember very quickly, because these terms, I even forget them sometimes, specific and diffuse. So just think about the idea of invisible cultural leanings. I mean, something that's invisible, try to bring it visible by using the analogy of a checklist. So if you're in a meeting and you hear those words, focus, guys, we need to establish a process or a procedure, something to that effect. Think about it like a checklist. Maybe you checked into the hospital and they're asking for your insurance information and your name and your address and your social security number. Very checklist. They're not asking you how you like to drink your coffee, right? They don't ask you about your hobbies. They're asking you about your health. They're asking, very specific questions that will help that medical professional get to the bottom of what's happening with you as quickly as possible. That's very specific, and that's very needed in that type of an environment. All right, let's move over to diffuse now. So for diffuse, we have, the first one is relationships. So the key here is we want to focus on the relationship. Now, I don't really have a measure to give you as to how often you're going to fall into one or the other. Remember that first and foremost, people will operate off of one of these two cultural leanings depending on their background. More often than not, although this is not always the case, of course, but more often than not, people from Western culture fall into the specific type of cultural leaning, and people from Latin America or Asia tend to fall here. Although I have traveled to Africa, I don't know for certain where they fall, but there are some resources that are available that help you understand this from basically the entire world. But even within cultures, you're going to see both of these sides. So don't get too locked into, I'm speaking with a Latino, therefore they must be like this. That would be a mistake. But to say, hey, Latinos tend to be a little more diffuse in their discussion would be accurate. The same way that maybe Norwegians might be a little more specific in the way that they engage, or people from Denmark or something like that. So the first one is relationships. The next one is openness. One of the precursors to openness is curiosity. So the best thing you can do, let's just kind of put yourself back into that meeting. If you're in this meeting, any meeting for that matter, it's very common for people to think about what they're going to say. So maybe I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I want to say that I worked for the company for this many years because that's what the previous person said as you're introducing yourself. And that I work in this position, and that, this is the type of work that I do within my position. So you're describing a job, you're describing yourself, but only from the framework of your job. And people naturally go there because it is a work meeting. So naturally you're thinking, well, that's aligned, right? If we're talking about work and this is a work meeting, therefore I should stick with that specific type leaning. However, if your goal is to get to know somebody and be more memorable, then you're better off remaining very curious. So I would say just kind of like take that and just put it in the garbage can. This idea of my title, for instance, that conversation I had with this woman, I never once mentioned how many years I worked for the company. I never mentioned my title per se. I just described myself as working within this work group. What is this work group? Who knows, because it's not memorable. Ultimately, for the purpose of that meeting, this person and everybody else wouldn't remember it anyway. So what's the point? You know what I mean? Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, that it's not important. It's just not relevant for the purpose of that meeting. So you don't lead with that. Not that you can't say it or that it's, off limits, but you just don't lead necessarily with that. What you do lead with is curiosity and openness. So I'm going to go back to my board here. Openness is having the ability to be very active in the way that you listen, which is why I put it down here. People who tend to be diffuse in their cultural leanings tend to have active listening skills that are greater or beyond those who are specific, because they're listening for this. They're trying to find, those clues. And by the way, the icon here is a detective. So whereas in a specific type leaning, think of it like of a checklist. If you tend to lean more diffuse, or if you want to be more memorable or want to operate that way in the meeting, think of it like of a detective. So, I always think of like Sherlock Holmes could be a good image, and this might not be a very good magnifying glass, but that's what that is supposed to mean. So you're looking for clues. You're basically on a mission, like a scavenger hunt. So as people are talking, you're like, ooh, they said this. Oh, they said that. Think about it like the meeting that I was in with this woman who said, I live in Ireland, but I'm from Greece. That's a piece of information. And by the way, Greece is very diffuse in their leaning. So it just lends itself to having that type of a discussion. Whereas if I were meeting somebody, say from Germany, without creating, any stereotypes, I might not necessarily lead with a diffuse style. I might be a little bit more focused on objectives, or somebody from Belgium, because they tend to be a little more specific, or from the Netherlands, for instance. People from the Netherlands tend to be very, very specific in the way that they lean. So trying to create relatability right off the bat with somebody who's not used to doing that, culturally speaking, could be detrimental to the relationship, the professional relationship. With that, do keep in mind, it helps to know how people may lean based on cultural heritage, but don't make that assumption just off the bat. So kind of put that into your pocket as this is another piece of information I can use, but don't necessarily, lean entirely there, because with anything, people are there. Soren Kierkegaard would say, and I'm not sure that I'm even pronouncing his name the right way, think of people as mysteries, not summaries. So even people, maybe a very Danish type individual who would be very stoic and focused, they could actually be very diffuse. So kind of keep an open mind there. Ultimately, attentiveness is a key there as well. So be attentive to what is being said, be attentive to how it's said. So for instance, this woman who said, I live in Ireland, but I'm originally from Greece, and I moved from Greece. So she mentioned the word Greece several times, whereas she only mentioned Ireland once. And I took that as a sign that she has a very proud Greek heritage. And I think that tends to be true with the people that I've met, at least from Greece. They tend to be very, just very proud of their culture, and rightfully so, like most people should be. But so I leaned into that, and I thought, well, she mentioned it, and then she seems to exhibit a strong sense of pride or connection in her heritage. So that could be, remember, you're kind of like a detective, right? That could be a good topic to discuss. Now, see, she said many different things, but that was the one that I leaned into, and I was right. I mean, I hit the nail on the head, because the moment I mentioned that, and specifically that I had traveled to Athens, and then I mentioned a very secluded place that I ended up kayaking around, which by the way was pretty neat. It was the Poseidon's temple, which was a little bit out of the way. It wasn't really a tourist trap at all. And she knew exactly, it was right on the agency, and she said, I know exactly what we're talking about. So even more shared meaning, more connection. So ultimately, I still don't know much about her from a professional setting, but the next time we talk, there's already an instant connection that we've made over that piece of information that I leaned into. So that makes the working portion of the relationship a lot smoother because the guard is down, or significantly lowered at least, and people tend to, you became relatable. Like in that moment, I became much more relatable to her than other members of the team who were in that same call, and that she may not necessarily remember, who they are or what they did, right? So introductions, definitely lean diffuse as much as you can. Due process, procedures, safety, anything that's very tactical in nature, try to go this way when you lead meetings like that. And ultimately the key here is just like keep an open mind and stay vigilant to that. Even use this like detective skill over here to try to identify the setting and the people, right? So that you can flex a little bit. And this is all, by the way, part of these like invisible cultural forces that very few people understand and know about, but the moment that you start to identify them, it's like you have an immediate advantage, because at that point you're a step or two steps ahead. You know how to interact, you know how to lead. There's just your opportunity to engage with other people is just going to grow exponentially as a result of that. So I hope this was helpful and useful. Follow me for more videos like this, and remember to check out my book. I talk about this in my book, as well as many other themes that have to do with these invisible cultural forces. There was one thing I added on the board at the end, which is the idea of achievement and ascription. We'll talk about that in a different video, but those are also some things that can come into play in the way that you display your leadership, and ultimately knowing these little secrets or tips to how to engage in the workplace in a professional setting, and even just in general. If you're going into a restaurant, or you're just having coffee, or you're meeting your in-laws, or whatever that might be, knowing how these things play out, these invisible cultural forces play out, will definitely help you align the way that you think, you communicate, and the way that you lead. Thanks, guys. We'll see you on the next one.